Welcome to the Inside Scoop Live podcast, where indie authors get personal about their books, their writing, and their passions. I'm your host, Sherry Hoyt. Join me for some lively conversations with debut indie authors and seasoned veterans alike. It's a great place to find your next amazing read or even get inspired. So sit back and enjoy the show and let me know what you think. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to have Jeffrey Marshall with us today to discuss his latest novel, Squeeze Plays. It's a gripping tale that dives deep into the opulent and often treacherous world of money and power, set against the vibrant backdrops of New York and London. As we know, every author has a story behind the books, and here's the inside scoop on our guest today. Jeffrey Marshall is a writer, novelist, and poet from Scottsdale, Arizona. He's the author of 5 books, including the novel Squeeze Plays, Little Miss Sure Shot, and Undetected. Undetected and Squeeze Plays were named ShelfUnbound Notable 100 Indie Books in 2020 and 2022, respectively, and Squeeze Plays also was named a Book Excellence Award winner in 2023. A retired journalist and the former editor of 2 national business magazines, Marshall has freelanced to more than 30 publications as varied as the New York Times, High Country News, and Tail Fly Fishing magazine, and his short fiction has appeared in online magazines like Bright Flash Literary Review, Ariel Chart, and Vocal.com, among others. As well, a short story he wrote took first place in the 2022 Arizona Authors Competition. You can learn more about Jeffrey Marshall and his work at jmarshbks.com. Well, hi, Jeffrey. Welcome to Inside Scoop Live.
I'm delighted to be with you, Sherry.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited to learn more about your story. So I guess just to get us started, why don't you tell us what Squeeze Plays is about?
Well, it's variously labeled as a financial thriller, a satire, and maybe a suspense production. I really consider it kind of a contemporary morality tale. It involves a look at the uses and misuses of wealth and power. It's set in New York and London, and involves principally 3 characters: a bank CEO, a tabloid publisher, both of those in New York, and a Russian oligarch who's headquartered in London. He becomes kind of a central bad actor in the story. And then I have my hero is really a financial journalist who gets wind of some of the things that are happening involving these characters: a loan that's been called, a financing that comes to fruition secretly. And he ties all of this together in a kind of what becomes a major front page expose. And that kind of leaves all the 3 other characters in a bit of a bad light. But throughout the story, essentially, really does look at the foibles and some of the ways that power and wealth are used and misused.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were talking, it sounds like a ripped from the headlines kind of story. So
There is some of that, although I don't think, we don't know much about Russian oligarchs. There's certainly, we hear a lot about them and their mega yachts and their helicopters and their possible ties to Putin. But all this that I came up with is kind of out of my own imagination. I didn't do any research about it.
Okay. All right. I love the title, Squeeze Plays. What does that represent?
If you look on Amazon, there are a lot of books called Squeeze Play, and some of those are probably baseball related. But a squeeze play is a pressure, whether it's blackmail, a sabotage, financial pressure of one kind or another. And since there are a number of them throughout the story, it just seemed like a good title to me. It really kind of encapsulates it.
Yeah, just adding that extra S on the end to make it.
Yes.
Yeah. So what did inspire the storyline?
Well, it's an interesting, my wife actually said to me at one point, I'd written 2 novels and I was casting around for an idea for a 3rd. And she said, why don't you write about Bob? Bob was just an amazing character. He was a journalist that I worked for in New York, financial journalist. And he's depicted very closely in the book. He's kind of a mad character who's got a very low boiling point. And he's someone who, you wouldn't look at this person and think, well, there's a great journalist. But he had a certain way about him. He was very, not only very forceful, but very resourceful. And but he had a major downside, his temper and the way he carried on with with people and with sources. And so he becomes the sort of the central character in terms of unraveling this story. And I think that, it kind of works into my own history as a financial journalist, trying to dig out the way the things happen, the way a lot of things are concealed. And Bob does a lot of that in this story.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I was thinking that the financial reporter was about you. So no, not.
No, it wasn't me. He's not really an equivalent, but he's probably about as something of an alter ego. I'll admit that, sure.
You mentioned the financial hubs, New York and London. What prompted that decision to set your story in those two
Well,
cities?
I think there's a very interesting dynamic of different places. They're the two financial capitals of the world. I mean, you could argue that maybe Singapore or Tokyo has a place in that, but it becomes kind of a central conflict. Certainly, in the original part, the first part of the story, is the fact that the bank CEO is in New York, but the chairman is in London, and they have their different ways of doing things. And it becomes something of an issue that the CEO in New York is trying to deal with. And they have different cultures. I mean, New York is, I think, much more of a frenetic place. London is a little more laid back. And then you come into the whole area of Bond Street in London, and kind of works into the English aristocracy. And so there are elements of that I wanted to get into the book.
Now, I know there are going to be people that disagree with me, but I think finance is such a complex world. So
it is.
Yeah, it is. And it kind of makes my head spin if I think too much about it. But how did you go about making the story engaging and accessible to a wide readership or readers like me?
Well, I think the main thing I did was I didn't go deep into the weeds. I mean, this is not a book about trying to understand the intricacies of finance. I'm really dealing with some very, very basic elements like lending, the fact that this loan has been denied, who gets involved with that, merchant bankers. And then there's the issue of things like the oligarch buys a great deal of the stock on the open market, and that allows him to put pressure on the bank. So there are kind of basic tenets of finance that are in there, but nothing that, smacks of, getting a degree in accounting or being a CFO or anything of that nature.
Right, right. And then I guess there's the balance of the tabloid industry and then the Russian influence as well. So, yeah.
Yes, and we can certainly talk about the media and the newspaper industry, which I was a part of for many years, and unfortunately, I don't need to tell you, journalism is in a pretty bad state right now. Print journalism, especially.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned your experience in the journalism field. So how much influence did your background have on the story?
A great deal. The last 25 years of my career were in financial journalism, banking and finance. And that may sound very narrow, but there was a lot going on. There was a lot of personalities. There are mergers. The banking industry consolidated an enormous amount. And then, the whole issue of leverage buyouts and all that. Now, I didn't get into that with this story, but there was a great deal of ferment going on in the 80s and 90s in finance. A lot of that is kind of carried over. We certainly had our problems in 2008 with, the Great Recession. A lot of that was caused by excesses in finance, of course. But so my career was generally kind of I read the Wall Street Journal religiously every day. So I kind of had a broader background than it might be suggested by just talking about kind of banking and the related aspects of finance.
Right, right. Now let's talk about some of your characters. I'm kind of a character-driven gal.
Yeah, and this is a character-driven story.
Yeah, yeah. Now you have two powerful men at the top, a bank CEO, a New York tabloid publisher, as you mentioned. How did you develop their dynamics and their conflicting interests?
Yeah, certainly the bank CEO he was probably my most sympathetic character. He's somebody who clearly rose on his merits. He had an Ivy League background, a long background with a major bank in New York. He's smart, he's sophisticated, and he's just kind of a nice guy who has done well. But then again, he gets involved with some nefarious stuff later on. But the tabloid publisher is very different. He's someone who basically came into this as a family sinecure. He's really lazy, not very principled, doesn't have a great deal to offer, but he's the chairman of this company. And in some ways, I guess you could say that I modeled him somewhat on our most current former president.
Interesting. Well, I'll just leave that there. But speaking of antagonists, let's talk a little bit about yours. He's a Russian oligarch and kind of under the guise of a financial savior. And that's kind of a different twist. So what led you to incorporate this character?
As I started thinking about the novel, I knew I needed a kind of a villain. And what better villainy than coming from Russia? I mean, and someone who possibly has some contacts to the government. It's not, I don't spell that out. I don't, it's not necessary. But, I think these people, these oligarchs have found a way to sort of inveigle themselves into the top, levels of finance around the world. Many of them are very clever. A lot of them are now based in London, and that's where I base this character. And it seems like they're always looking for an angle. I mean, they're buying sports teams or this or that. My guy is buying real estate. He's buying tech companies in various places around the world, and he's really trying to make a bigger beachhead in New York. So that becomes the central focus of a lot of what he's up to in the story.
Now, your hero, as you mentioned, is a financial reporter, and he is the star. He uncovers the deeper story. You have 3 strong male characters in your story. There's also a mention of some strong and principled female characters. Share more about their role.
I would focus on the role principled. Let me talk about the 2 principal ones. One is the wife of the tabloid publisher. She's a well-known designer, famous designer, has her own line. So she's a businesswoman, and she's quite astute. She has a daughter who's a freshman in college, and she basically is something of a countervailing balance on her husband. I mean, she's constantly either kind of rolling her eyes or chiding him a little bit about his excesses or his failings. And, he understands where she's coming from. So she's kind of, as I say, a bit of a counterweight. And the other character is a Russian who's working for the oligarch, and she becomes kind of his go-to sexual bait for his sexual blackmail. But she's more than that. And, she's very smart. She's a business analyst who works primarily in London and is brought to New York for this escapade. But then she kind of turns the needle back onto the oligarch, and that becomes kind of a major twist in the story.
Oh, wow. Okay. Did you have any trouble writing from a woman's perspective? Was there any difference at all?
I don't think so. I guess, when we get into the whole issue of POV, point of view, and most of this was kind of more omniscient. I didn't really take, it wasn't written from the women's perspective per se. But honestly, Sherry, I don't think there was anything that really could be construed as, did I deliberately kind of look at this in it coming from a different voice, from a different perspective.
Okay. All right. I wonder about that sometimes. It's like, well, I mean, men have been writing about women for centuries. They're
and probably not always well, I'm sure either.
So I don't know why that question is so curious to me, but
that's a valid question.
Now, you talked a little bit about sexual blackmail, and so that's kind of I guess the more scandalous side of the story.
Yeah, that's kind of the most scandalous or dangerous element in this. I mean, I guess I go back to, a lot of the novels that I read where there's not a great deal of sex in this book, and certainly not described very carefully or, elaborately. But I think it brings a certain amount of spice, and it certainly would be a cause for blackmail, and it was in this case. So it just kind of, maybe it got back to my reading of James Bond and some of the related kind of stories.
Yeah. Well, I always think it adds a nice little, like you said, spice to it. So yeah. Without going into detail, because there's really no need. I mean, unless that's the point,
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. So we talked a lot about characters, and actually it got me thinking about the actual writing of the story and how your characters got along, so to speak, with the plot you devised. Did they ever take off in ways you hadn't planned?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think I developed this kind of reverse blackmail that takes place later in the novel after kind of thinking about, well, what about this would be an interesting twist. So that's where the woman lieutenant of the oligarch gets involved with maybe saying, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe you can do this to him and kind of reverse this blackmail that he's put on you."
Mm-hmm. So does that kind of mess up your outline, or do you use an outline?
I've had some interesting conversations on interviews and podcasts about this. I'm very definitely what they call a pantser, seat of the pants. I am very much against formal outlines, and I think that goes back to my 8th grade English class where we were asked to do that.
Yeah.
So I don't have a formal outline. What I generally do is I kind of, create some post-it notes about things that I want to get to and decide when I want to get to them. And it may be just a phrase or two, just a central plot point. And so I kind of go from there. I kind of hate to use the word organic, but that's kind of the way that I see these novels coming together. They kind of develop themselves without, obviously I'm the puppeteer,
Right.
but in fact, I rewrote the ending 3 times.
Oh,
So
wow.
there's just no way that anything was ever set in stone. It kind of grew and took different directions.
Okay. All right. So your characters did drive a bit of the plot then, probably. Huh?
Yes,
Yeah.
very much so.
Yeah. Now with Squeeze Plays, you mix some serious insight into wealth and power with some very humorous satirical elements. How did you find the right balance between the two?
Well, I think it's kind of an open question of whether, it's up to the reader to really decide whether how successful that is. But I really wanted to try to get a light touch to some of this. I mean, finance is obviously, it's not a subject that a lot of people gravitate to. And I also was tremendously inspired by Tom Wolfe's Bonfire of the Vanities, a wonderful, amazing book about New York in the late 80s and the difficulties that, people felt with money and power. And Winston Crum is the name of my publisher, and he's the butt of a great deal of the satire. But some of the other things are just about New York and sort of this upper class mentality of, which, Park Avenue, whatever, kind of worked into the story. And that's kind of ripe sometimes for a little bit of lighthearted humor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's nice to break up the serious elements
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, I mean, I don't know. Sometimes I want to read to learn, but most of the time I want to read to be entertained. So,
You want to be entertained. And I'm hoping that, people that pick up this book, hopefully they'll learn something, particularly if they don't know something about some of these basic financial things, but it's an entertainment at the end of the day.
right. So, what kind of feedback have you received on Squeeze Plays?
Well, I've got some wonderful reviews, and being an indie author, I haven't been reviewed by, the huge publications, but I've gotten a lot of very nice professional reviews, most of them 5-star. And they kind of understand that, this is a kind of a complicated novel that works on several different levels, including the satire. And those reviewers have been mostly very high on it, and I've been very gratified by that. And the Amazon reviewers as well, and some on Goodreads. I mean, I've been certainly been gratified by the response and hope there's more of it.
Yeah, yeah, of course. That's great. So, beyond the financial play and the character dynamics, is there a deeper message or commentary you hope to convey about the world of wealth and power and the media?
Well, I think let me start with the media, because I think I'd like to hope that, certainly based on the way my novel develops, the media has a very important role to play in getting at some of the issues that wealth and power create. Some of them are kind of nefarious and they're secret. And, I think it's going to be more and more difficult for the media to kind of unravel some of these strands. But wealth and power are only being concentrated around the world. I think, whether you look at, the oligarchs or Rupert Murdoch or some of these conglomerates, I mean, that's kind of, the world is moving towards making things bigger and bolder, and that can carry some problems. And so that's kind of what I'm hinting at in the novel here, and basically in the form of the oligarch. But I think it's something that the world is going to have to wrestle with in the next few generations.
Do you think there's a way to get back to balanced reporting?
Balanced in the sense of
Just writing the news, not the opinion about, whatever side of the...
Yeah, well, I'd like to, I guess my perspective on that is kind of antediluvian, but I grew up in an era when, objectivity was really the goal. I mean, it was never frowned upon. And now, I think social media and bloggers have really, turned the tables in the last 20 years, and it's become, and unfortunately, a lot of the public has become much more skeptical of the news media because they do perceive it as being opinionated. And if it's opinionated in a way they don't like, they reject it.
Mm-hmm.
So I would always argue that, objectivity is crucial. The opinion belongs in the opinion pages, but, that's pretty difficult when we've got 20 million people on Facebook every minute, absorbing something else.
Yeah, yeah. Facebook is not news, folks.
No.
Yeah. So what are you working on now?
Well, I'm kind of twixt in between. I started another thriller, and Squeeze Plays is my third novel. They're all independent of each other. There are no characters that carry over from one to another.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of my take on writing novels. I think, writing the serials has been very effective for many people. But it's not just what I wanted to do. So I'm working on a thriller that takes place in Massachusetts. It's kind of about a woman who gets involved with a very serious problem. It's perceived as an accident, but maybe it isn't.
Mm.
And I'm kind of trying to develop a backstory for her and for her sister and for another character. And so it's going to have some family elements to it, but I'm really not that far into it at this point. And, like, as I say, as a pantser, I'm still trying to figure out where I'm going next.
Yeah. So do you take your time writing your novels?
I do. I wrote a lot during the pandemic. It was a particularly good time for a writer, but I take my time, and at this point, I'm kind of waiting for inspiration, and that's kind of the way I work. If I'm inspired, I can work in bursts, and I'll go back and say, oh, well, I've got another idea for that, or another sentence, or another phrase. But right now, I'm kind of at a bit of a, just kind of waiting for that inspiration.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one could argue that results in a better book 'cause you're not on a deadline. Okay, I got to get a novel out in a year.
Exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, good. Now, you mentioned your two other novels. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those?
Sure. Yeah. The first novel I wrote was a fictionalized version of the life of Annie Oakley, taking it kind of episodically. And I didn't want to write a biography, and fiction may be kind of a strong word for some. A great deal of it was taken from the actual facts of her life.
Yeah.
But I kind of wrote around that. I kind of riffed on it, and I enjoyed doing that. I didn't have to do an enormous amount of research. A lot of it was kind of, structured around a few things that I read, and I kind of just extrapolated on that.
Oh, wow.
And then the second book is called Undetected. It's a psychological thriller. And I started to write as a family dynamic, and then I just couldn't really make that work that well. It became really about a woman who's got really a mysterious and dark past, who marries into a new family in Westchester County, New York. And she turns out to be a black widow who has, done some damage to a couple of husbands.
Oh, wow.
And one of the family, actually another journalist who's kind of my alter ego in this case for sure, kind of starts digging around, uses a private detective, and makes some, kind of startling findings about her and her past.
Yeah. Well, I say write about what you know, right? So
exactly.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting that, your novels are all different, but it sounds like you're leaning towards the thriller genre.
Yeah, I really do enjoy thrillers, and I don't know exactly why I gravitate toward that. I have a hard time explaining it to you, but it just seems to be a genre that is kind of meant for me.
Yeah. Well, it's a very popular genre, and
I know.
That's good and bad, I guess.
Right.
Well, I guess based on your writing and publishing journey, what advice would you offer to aspiring authors, especially in the publishing world today?
Yeah, I've heard this statistic that perhaps there are a million self-published books being written every day
Ugh,
or every year, I'm sorry, in
yeah.
the US. Um, it's very difficult to get an agent or to go through traditional publishing unless you've done exceptionally well in some sort of MFA class or you've come to their attention somehow. So if you're talking about being a self-published author, which the vast majority of us are,
Hmm.
you've got to think about things like persistence. Writing a book takes a long time. It can take years. You go at your own pace. I think people should read a lot and get comfortable with what the kind of voice that they want to create, the kind of characters they want to create. It's never easy, but there's so many. Some people may want to write romance, some want to write horror. It really depends on kind of what you want, and I think it's important to get feedback, and not just from your family or your friends, but get professional feedback. Get it from somehow get involved with writing classes or professional editors, people who really can give you a good handle on what you're doing and how good it is.
Hmm.
And don't necessarily be discouraged. I mean, look at all the stories we've heard about people who got 100 rejections and then got one agent, and suddenly they have a bestseller.
Right.
Lightning can strike, but it's not an easy road, and you just got to be patient.
Yeah. Yeah. And, well, there's pros and cons to both roads for sure. Um,
Yes.
but even with traditional publishing, you're still going to have to do a lot of your own marketing. So,
Yeah, marketing is the hardest part and particularly for indie publishers. It's been very difficult for me, and social media is not a natural forum for a lot of people.
hmm.
Just kind of being out there all the time and promoting yourself, and if you have any inklings of modesty, and I know I do myself. It's kind of hard to be out there blowing your horn all the time, and oh, who's this guy?
Yeah. Yeah. And then they tell you, okay, you have to do your own marketing, but don't necessarily blow your own horn because you don't want to sound like that guy that,
Yeah, and
is
how do
just
you?
pushing your
Yeah,
pushing your
I haven't
book.
found I haven't found that. And if you look at a lot of author forums, what they're doing is they're basically pushing their own books because that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
It's about creating a brand. If you want to create a brand, or certainly pushing sales because you're writing for an audience, not just for yourself.
Right. Well, Jeffrey, was there anything else you wanted to add today?
I would tell your readers they could find out more about the books and about me if they're interested on my website, which is jmarshbks.com.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining me today on Inside Scoop Live, and thank you for sharing more about you and your work.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Sherry. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for joining me today for my interview with Jeffrey Marshall, author of Squeeze Plays. You can learn more about Jeffrey and his work at jmarshbks.com. And be sure and check out our other interviews on InsideScoopLive.com.